Chapter 5. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, Supermati stepped out of the train in Paris and slowly made his way toward the station exit. He knew he was expected, for he had sent a telegram announcing his arrival. Soon he noticed a footman wearing the same livery he had seen in Venice on Narayana's servants, and he called the man over. A few minutes later, an elegant carriage was swiftly carrying him toward the new palace. With a sensation of pleasure and a peculiar feeling of well-being, he leaned back against the satin cushions of the coach. Truly, I cannot understand how one could ever grow tired of such a delightful existence, even if it were to last 1,000 years, always enjoying health, always surrounded by luxury. Ah, if one had to be poor and suffering, naked, hungry, and forever laboring like a draft horse, then indeed I would be grateful for deliverance from such eternal torment, he thought. Supermati had never been to Paris, and therefore had not the slightest idea where he was being taken, and he looked about with curiosity. Evidently, they were driving through the outskirts. Then the carriage turned into an oak avenue and entered a shady park enclosed by a tall bronze grille. Soon a building in the style of Louis XIV came into view, and the carriage stopped before it. In the entrance hall, the entire household staff stood assembled to greet their master. From the elderly butler Supermati learned that the Belle Etage was reserved for receptions, while the prince's private apartments were located on the first floor. Preceded by the butler and accompanied by his future valet, Supermati ascended the carpeted staircase adorned with rare plants and began to inspect his new domain. The furnishings everywhere were in harmony with the style of the building and the taste of Louis XIV. Here, even more than in Venice, everything recalled Narayana. Clearly, he had spent long periods in this residence. In the drawing room, draped in white damask, a full-length portrait of the deceased hung in a massive gold frame. In the study, an open book lay upon the desk. Letters, some opened, others not, were scattered on the bureau, along with a sheet of paper bearing a few hastily written lines, and in the ashtray lay a small stack of gold coins casually dropped there. The bedroom likewise bore numerous traces of its last owner. Books and magazines piled upon the night table, mixed with various trinkets strewn across the divan and the couch by the window, testified to how carefully everything had been preserved so that upon his return the master might find all as he had left it. After paying due homage to an exquisite dinner and calling for his dressing gown, this time he had supplied himself with a proper wardrobe in the port city where he had disembarked. He dismissed the servant and settled into the study, where a large fire blazed brightly and cheerfully in the hearth. Noticing a door half hidden by a heavy curtain, he opened it and stepped out onto a flower-decked balcony. It was cold outside. The autumn wind whistled, shaking the half-bare trees, while a fine, steady rain fell from above. But Supermati recalled with satisfaction that he had no fear of catching cold, and he began to survey his new estate. Despite the advancing night, one could still make out the large and beautiful garden, the statues gleaming white through the branches, and the basin where a fountain was meant to play. Below stretched a terrace far larger than the balcony. This terrace was bordered by a balustrade, and a wide staircase of white marble led down into the garden. Evidently, the apartments that opened upon this terrace were those he had not yet seen. Truly, I am a shepherd transformed into a king's son, Supermati murmured, returning to the bedroom and lying down on the divan to smoke a cigar. Watching with an absent gaze the delicate rings of smoke, he pondered what he was to do in this city, so strange to him and where he did not know a single soul. First of all, he would visit the museums and attend the theater. That pleasure he had allowed himself even in the days of his poverty. Now, the only difficulty lay in choosing and in giving the order to secure a box and harness the carriage. Indeed, this soft divan with its embroidered green velvet cushions was far preferable to a pine coffin and a lonely grave in a cemetery. However beautifully the poets describe death, its approach sends a shudder through even the bravest of men. And concerning the life beyond the grave, there exist only the vaguest of hints. No, he was happy to live, and he would use this long life to do good for his fellow creatures. How much poverty could be relieved? How many tears dried? He recalled several families from his former medical practice. In one, the father, suffering from rheumatism, needed a long stay in a warm climate. In another, the son was a maniac, yet there were no means to treat him before the illness turned into complete madness. Ah, all this he would remedy at once. But the most vivid memory he preserved was of a young girl who lived quietly with her perpetually ill mother and who had inspired in him a sympathy very close to love. Margarita Wilson was a pretty, slender girl with large dark eyes, tender as those of a gazelle, and short curling hair. Ralph Morgan had often dreamed of making this pure and gentle child the companion of his life. She would have loved him and tended him with the same complete self-sacrifice with which she cared for her mother. With emotion, he remembered the young girl's self-denial, working without rest and depriving herself of necessities to surround her mother with comfort. Now Margarita was an orphan. 2 years earlier, her mother had died, and the young girl earned her bread by hurrying from lesson to lesson all day long in all weathers, though she was frail and inclined to consumption. Besides all this, poor Margarita must have been deeply troubled. Despite her modesty and reserve, Ralph Morgan had suspected that the young girl was interested in him and perhaps even secretly loved him. From Patrick, she had undoubtedly learned of his mysterious departure and now knew not what to think. A heavy sigh escaped Supermati's breast. He knew that all was over between him and Margarita. He was married to Nara, whose dazzling beauty eclipsed the gentle girl with the clear and tender gaze. But he could help her and make her independent. Was he not master of inexhaustible wealth? Fired by this thought, he leapt from the divan and began pacing rapidly about the room. Yes, tomorrow he would send Miss Wilson an anonymous gift. He would not lose even a single day in rescuing her from the exhausting toil that was draining her strength. Seizing his wallet, he emptied it and counted the money he had brought with him. In his opinion, it was too little. Yet to establish his rights to the inheritance, fulfill all formalities, and then consult a banker. All this seemed far too slow for an impatient young man. I must search here. Narayana always kept funds in his cabinets and drawers, he muttered, glancing around the room. Against the wall, he noticed a chiffonier similar to the one he had seen in the study in Venice, except that the latter had been of ebony, while this one was of rosewood. It only needed to be opened. If the note left by Narayana spoke the truth, then the little gold key hanging from Supermati's watch chain should unlock all the cabinets that had been in his predecessor's personal use. Quickly detaching the key, Supermati tried to insert it into the keyhole. It slid in, turned easily, and the chiffonier opened. Very pleased, he pulled up a table, placed a lit candelabrum upon it, and began his inspection. He soon found what he was searching for. A mother-of-pearl casket was filled with gold and banknotes. Nevertheless, Supermati continued rummaging through the chiffonier, astonished at the enormous quantity of women's belongings stored inside. One drawer was crammed with silk stockings, gloves, fish shoes, and handkerchiefs. Nearby lay a pair of red satin shoes, and even found two black women's shifts trimmed with costly lace. In another drawer, he discovered artificial flowers, an entire collection of fans, and a jewel box. I must admit that my predecessor was quite the rake, Supramati muttered, shaking his head. No wonder Nara has such a poor opinion of marriage. Emptying the largest of the caskets, he filled it with a considerable sum of money and added two sets of ornaments, one of diamonds, the other of rubies, each worth a fortune, and two fans that seemed to him the finest. Then, filling the remaining space with smaller jewels, he closed the casket. Tomorrow morning, I shall add a note informing Margarita that the gift is sent by her father's former debtor, Supramati thought, well satisfied. Humming a tune, he began tossing back into the chiffonier the things he had removed. But when he pushed one small box rather forcefully toward the back, a faint crack sounded. Curious, Supramati bent down and, to his great astonishment, saw that the metal corner of the box had struck a hidden spring that opened a secret compartment. He slid the panel aside and pulled out a white bundle. It proved to be a hastily folded garment of fine batiste trimmed with costly lace, with something long and hard felt within its folds. Growing ever more intrigued, Supramati brought over the lamp, unfolded the parcel, and turned deathly pale. What he held was a woman's peignoir with wide open sleeves. At the level of the chest was a slit surrounded by a broad dark red stain. The entire hem and lace appeared soaked in blood. A small Eastern dagger with a curved Damascus blade and a jewel-studded handle was still clinging to the fabric, likewise covered in blackish stains. Numb with shock, the young doctor stared at these mute witnesses of a crime. But who was the culprit? Certainly Narayana, the owner of the chiffonier. But could he truly have been a murderer? And for what purpose had he committed this deed? How had this woman vanished without arousing suspicion? How had no one sought her? And who was this victim? The chiffonier suddenly took on an entirely new interest. Perhaps more clues might be found in the hidden compartment. Supramati began searching avidly and a moment later pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and a gold chain with a locket, on whose lid the name Liliana was spelled out in diamonds. Inside the locket was the portrait of a young woman of striking and unusual beauty. Large, velvety black eyes looked out disdainfully. On her half-open lips hovered a passionate smile. Short curling hair framed her charming head, giving her a strong resemblance to the famous Hortense Mancini. As for the crumpled paper, it proved to be a playbill upon which the murderer had wiped his bloody fingers, the print of them still clearly visible. Unfolding the sheet, Supramati read, "Benefit performance of the singer, Miss Liliana." The playbill had been printed a little over a year earlier. Unable to comprehend why Narayana had not destroyed such dangerous evidence of his crime, Supramati, deeply shaken, returned the sorrowful remnants of the bloody and unknown drama to the hidden compartment. Then, putting away the casket intended for Margarita and carefully locking the chiffonier, he went to bed, though he could not sleep for a long time, thinking of his strange and dreadful discovery. Supramati awoke late. He had just finished his breakfast and was leafing through some new journals when the footman brought him a visiting card on which Supramati read with great surprise, "Viscount Marcel de Lormel. This gentleman has already come several times to inquire whether your grace has arrived," added the footman. "How long have you been serving here?" "Only a week. They told me that the entire former staff had been dismissed by Mr. James. Now, While awaiting your grace's return, the house was refurnished, and before leaving, Mr. James appointed Mr. Gremier as steward. Supermati reflected. Obviously, this Viscount was one of his predecessor's acquaintances and did not yet know of Narayana's death. Perhaps this man, unknown to him but familiar with Paris, might become a pleasant companion and help him make some connections. Show the Viscount into the drawing room and ask him to wait a moment for me, he said, rising. Quickly dressing, Supermati went toward the drawing room, but before entering, he glanced through the curtain. A young man of about 30, dressed with extraordinary elegance, was pacing the room impatiently. One might have called him handsome, had not a sickly pallor, dark rings under his eyes, and premature wrinkles that furrowed his withered, prematurely aged face spoiled his otherwise attractive appearance. He seems to have thoroughly enjoyed life, Supermati thought as he entered. Hearing the door open, the Viscount, who had been standing before the portrait, turned quickly and exclaimed with joy, "At last you have returned to us, Nurai," he broke off, seeing a stranger before him, and apologized, embarrassed. "Forgive me, but I was told that Prince Narayana had returned from his travels. As one of his closest friends, I took the liberty of calling early. No apologies, I beg you, Viscount," Morgan said with a smile, extending his hand. "You were told the truth. I am Prince Narayana Supermati, younger brother and heir of your late friend." "Narayana is dead," the Viscount murmured, turning as white as a sheet. "Can it be possible? Alas, it is a sad truth." The Viscount was so distraught that even his hands trembled. After a painful minute of silence, he stammered, "It seems incredible. Narayana was so healthy, lively, and full of life that it seemed he might live 100 years. Even more," Morgan replied, inwardly amused by the remark. "My poor brother was not taken by illness, but by an accident while hunting in the Alps. He fell and was killed instantly. I arrived only to find his cold, lifeless body. What a misfortune! I am truly in despair over the loss of such a friend. Always kind and obliging, a true friend in every sense. I'd wager that our good Viscount waited so impatiently for Narayana and now grieves so theatrically because he hoped to borrow money," Supermati thought mockingly. Then, inviting his guest to sit, he said kindly, "I am deeply touched by the concern you show for my bereavement, and I hope, Viscount, that you will grant me a portion of the friendship you bestowed upon my late brother. I have only just arrived in Europe and know absolutely no one in Paris, so I would be delighted if you would take me under your wing." Pleasant surprise lit the Viscount's pale face, and a hope stirred in his anxious heart that this new friendship would prove as profitable as the former. "I am entirely at your service, Prince. Command me as you will," he replied eagerly. "On the contrary, Viscount, I place myself at your disposal. I hope you will be so kind as to organize a program to help me orient myself in Paris. I should like to see the sights of the capital and also amuse myself a little." The Viscount leapt up as if electrified. "You may rely on me, Prince. I shall devote myself to the task and hope to satisfy you completely. For today I propose this. First, a drive in the Bois de Boulogne, where you will see both society and the demi-mondaine. Then we shall dine at my place, if you will do me the honor of accepting. There I shall introduce you to two delightful young men, my friends. In the evening we shall attend a new operetta, and afterwards sup at a restaurant where I shall acquaint you with several actresses and theater ladies who are my friends. It is our duty, we of the nobility, to support talent. The program is quite full, and perhaps even a little too lively given my recent mourning, Supramaty observed. Still, it is so tempting that I accept and thank you. In that case, Prince, allow me to leave you for half an hour. I must secure a box. Oh, you need not trouble yourself. I shall give the order at once, Supramaty replied, touching the electric bell. An hour later, Supramaty and the Viscount were riding in a magnificent carriage. The splendid team, as well as the handsome stranger seated beside Viscount Marcel, made a notable impression upon the usual visitors of the Bois de Boulogne, especially the ladies of the demi-monde, who burned with curiosity to know who he might be. The Viscount, however, did not hurry to satisfy the curiosity of the charming sinners. Pleading dampness, he dissuaded Supramaty from walking and then drove him straight to his own home. The Viscount occupied a bachelor apartment on the Boulevard Haussmann, elegant, cozy, and even luxurious. Host and guest were chatting over cigars when the Viscount's friend arrived, and he presented Baron Robert de Lanzac and Captain Charles de Marin to Supramaty. Both had known Narayana and were astonished by his sudden death and by the arrival of his heir. Later, as the Viscount showed his new friend a collection of cigar cases and pipes, the Baron whispered to the captain, "What luck for that cursed Viscount," instantly ingratiating himself with the air of that fool. Mark my words, thanks to this new friendship, he will pay off all his debts. Most likely. And just wait. There will be a battle among our ladies for such a rich morsel as this nabob, the officer replied, just as quietly. Dinner was excellent. Fine wines flowed freely, and Supramaty honored them well. But the conversation, growing livelier as the bottles emptied, inwardly repelled him. The frivolous talk, the indecent anecdotes, and the shameless cynicism with which every topic was discussed oppressed the sober and modest doctor, who had never before been present in such a company. Light-mindedly and maliciously the speakers slandered and cast shadows upon the reputations of many women whose names were unknown to Supramaty and mocked respectable families who, in their opinion, had too many children. This edifying discussion so absorbed them that they did not even notice the unpleasant impression their chatter made on Supramaty, who barely uttered a word. Great God, he thought, is it possible that intelligent people waste their lives on such trifles, wither in shameful idleness, and occupy themselves only with gossip, revelry, wandering the streets, and telling lewd anecdotes, forgetting that they will have to pay dearly for such dissipation, and that premature old age, furrowing their brows with wrinkles and laying bare their skulls, is death itself stretching its cold hand toward them. Supramaty was seized with an irresistible desire to see to hear. To hear understood him. With him one could speak of everything that interested them both in their endless existence. The young doctor had to make a certain effort over himself in order to regain the necessary tone and take part in the conversation when the Viscount finally addressed him directly, noticing the silence of his dear guest. After dinner, everyone moved to the drawing room. Seeing several albums on the table, Supramaty began to flip through them. Suddenly, he remembered his ominous nighttime discovery. With this memory came the desire to learn at least something about that mysterious drama. If the victim, which, moreover, seemed certain was an actress, and her photograph was contained in one of the albums, then he could learn her biography and what had been supposed about her disappearance, for the Viscount surely knew well all backstage gossip. But he looked through one album and then another in vain. The one he sought was not among this collection of all sorts of celebrities. The master of the house, who had been watching him, approached the young man and, handing him the largest album, said with a laugh, "Look and choose, Prince. Everywhere you will be received with joy. Here I have gathered all the theatrical celebrities and demi-monde stars. Of course, you will not find any outstanding beauty here, but among these ladies are some very amusing and pleasant women." Supermati began to turn the pages of the album. This time he did not have to search long for the person who interested him. Yes, it was her curly head and provocative smile. Only instead of a ball gown, she wore an original Columbine costume. "I like this one," said Supermati, showing the portrait to the Viscount. Everyone leaned in with curiosity, and the captain exclaimed, "Ha! The beauty Liliana. That is what they call the sympathy of blood. Your late brother was mad about this woman. You are unlucky, Prince. It is precisely this one woman who pleases you that you cannot possess unless you marry your sister-in-law." "But how could it happen that you did not see Prince Narayana's widow at his funeral? Or did you not know he was married?" remarked the Viscount. "Narayana has long been married, and I know his wife. She is a charming blonde, bearing not the slightest resemblance to the original of this portrait," answered Supermati. Those present exchanged astonished glances. Well, what a secretive man. He never breathed a word about being married and lived here the life of a bachelor, said Lormel, shaking his head. "In any case, the princess never came here and never showed a sign of her existence," added Baron de Lanzac. "But what made you suppose that my brother wished to marry this Miss Liliana?" "Liliana herself told us that she was the prince's fiancée and would soon become his wife. Then one fine day, she disappeared without saying goodbye to anyone. It was about 6 weeks before Narayana's departure, and we assumed that, to avoid idle talk, they went away to be married somewhere quietly. In any case, marriage with this operetta singer with such a loud past would have been a monstrous misalliance for the prince. They also said that Narayana was jealous of an Italian who was courting Liliana intensely. Later, this gentleman was found dead in his bed. Many gossiped that Liliana's departure killed him, but I suppose he drank too much, and it caused his heart to burst," the Baron concluded with a laugh. "Ah, people always talk so much nonsense. From the fact that the late prince sometimes fell into gloomy moods and locked himself away, becoming invisible even to his closest friends, we concluded, for example, that he was a sorcerer or an Indian Mahatma, something like a mage. It was assumed, too, that he knew the secrets of making gold and preserving eternal youth. In short, if I begin to recount all the gossip about Narayana, I won't finish until tomorrow. So let us drop this foolishness and return to the main point. Liliana pleases you, and I predict that you will have her. Since Narayana did not marry her, she will return to us one fine day, and of course will be happy to find a new protector as handsome and generous as the one she lost." Supermati said nothing. He listened to the end of the conversation absent-mindedly. All his thoughts were concentrated on the dark drama whose traces he had uncovered. That the lovely actress had been killed by Narayana, he could no longer doubt. But did jealousy truly serve as the motive for the murder? This seemed incredible. And that Italian, his rival, had he really died of a heart attack? Or had he been the victim of a second murder? Absorbed in these questions swarming in his head, Supermati took little part in the general conversation. He only came to himself when the Viscount announced that it was time to go to the theater. The Viscount suggested that the Baron and the captain accompany them, and they readily agreed. In those times, when he was still Ralph Morgan, Supermati never went to operettas. Sickly, thrifty, forced to calculate his expenses strictly, he preferred to listen to a serious opera or a good concert, so the performance he now attended was something new to him. The piquancy of the situations and the freedom of the acting amused him greatly. Moreover, his vanity was flattered by the triumph accorded to him. Many opera glasses were directed at him. Many brilliant and evidently curious glances sought his box. Supramati innocently enjoyed this first public expression of respect for his person. As a modest doctor in an asylum for the insane, he had never attracted attention in a theater. He simply forgot that since then he had become a prince and a millionaire. He also did not know that owing to the Viscount and the Baron, who had many acquaintances in the audience, word had already spread that he was an Indian nabob and the heir of Prince Narayana, well known in the world of pleasure. After the performance, the whole party went to a first-class restaurant where private rooms had been reserved and dinner ordered in advance. Supramati was in excellent spirits. He laughed and accepted graciously the news that several ladies and gentlemen connected with the stage had been invited in his name. These are all first-rate talents, demigods of art, and our intimate friends, said the Viscount. I hope, dear Prince, that you will be pleased to meet these famous people. The men arrived first, and the Viscount introduced Horace Daniel, a dramatic actor, and Raphael Pinson of the Comédie Française. The first was a man of middle age, of substantial build, and with a luxuriant, artistically curled mane of hair. The other, tall and thin, had an affected appearance and was rouged. Monsieur Pinson played the roles of leading lovers and always remained in character. Both were evidently delighted to meet the nabob. The Viscount introduced them with such flattering expressions that Supramati could not help feeling extraordinarily honored to shake hands with such distinguished persons. In conversation, Daniel mentioned that he had known the late Prince Narayana well, an extraordinarily generous man, an enlightened patron of the arts and of talent. Supramati understood that, without compromising himself, he could not remain indifferent to the merits of art and talent, and inwardly resolved to be as brilliant a patron as his predecessor. A little later, the ladies arrived, evidently invited by the Viscount, so that his new friend might make a choice. They were Baretti from the circus, Pierrette from the Alcazar, and Camille Moucheron. All three were beautiful and spirited. One of them, it is true, had a Jewish type, and the Viscount whispered into Supramati's ear that the mother of the lovely Pierrette had been a Turkish woman, but that not a drop of Israelite blood flowed in the veins of this star, the Alcazar. The youngest, prettiest, and boldest among them turned out to be the 19-year-old Moucheron, with dazzling complexion and large blue eyes. Moucheron immediately sat beside Supramati, openly showing that she had decided to win him. Staring passionately at the nabob, she shot furious and threatening glances at her two rivals. Those glances clearly said, "Just dare to compete with me for him, and you will see what I am capable of." The Viscount noticed the storm clouds darkening the festive horizon, and as a skilled master of ceremonies took measures to prevent this hostility from turning into open battle. Champagne flowed without cease. Electrified by the conversation and the crossfire of witticisms, the usually sober and reserved Supramati emptied glass after glass, allowing the demimonde heroines to lavish their attentions on him and amusing himself with their rivalry. He was already quite drunk when he finally awarded the palm of victory to Pierrette, escorting her home in his own carriage despite Moucheron's fury. Naturally, the beautiful sinner did not let him leave. They dined together once more, and for the first time in his life, Supramati gave himself over to one of those wild pleasures that had been unknown to him until now. The next morning, Thanks to the marvelous properties of the elixir of life, Supramati felt fresh and vigorous, as if he had rested peacefully rather than spent the night in orgy. But his soul had sobered as well, and a flush of shame rose to his cheeks, for he clearly remembered what Nara had told him about the dissoluteness of men. And she had been right to despise him before she even knew him. Only one day had passed since his arrival in Paris, and he had already been unfaithful, and in the most unworthy manner, for it had not been prompted by a heartfelt passion, but by wine fumes. He had betrayed his wife with a depraved and shameless woman. He had not even felt great pleasure during the orgy held in his honor. Only the petty triumph of his new status had flattered his vanity and stirred emotions that had once been disciplined. Yet this shame gradually turned into irritation toward Nara. Had she not postponed their final union for a year, he would have lived modestly and honorably in Venice or somewhere else, and certainly would not have been wandering through cabarets in the company of ruined women. But since Nara herself had wished it, he had to pass the time somehow. And why should he not patronize talents as Narayana had done? Thank God, he had no need to be stingy. True, he had not yet had the opportunity to judge the talents of the people he had met the previous evening. The men had displayed only monumental cynicism and questionable morals. As for the women, he had never met anyone like them. The poor consumptive doctor could never have raised his eyes to backstage stars and high-flying courtesans, lacking the means to purchase the favor of those priestesses of pleasure who, like hyenas, contested among themselves for a rich and generous lover. And, indeed, everything about them is art, starting with the rouge that covers their cheeks and ending with their monologues of love, which they repeat both to a newcomer and to an experienced rake who keeps them only to give himself the appearance of a man of fashion wealthy enough to maintain them. Oh, these demi-monde ladies are charming, the Viscount told him yesterday with a deep sigh, but they are terribly greedy. What they extort would be enough to support 3 respectable families. To satisfy their tastes, men risk complete ruin. At the memory of this remark, a smile crossed Supramati's lips. He did not risk ruin, neither material nor physical, but even so, he would amuse himself with moderation. By breakfast time, the Viscount arrived with an unusually varied program for the day, but Supramati declared that he wanted to visit Notre Dame Cathedral and the Louvre. However, he agreed to go to the Alcazar in the evening. And then supper with Pierrette? Asked the Viscount with a meaningful look. Oh no, to enjoy the company of Mademoiselle Pierrette every day would be far too boring. Understand, you still feel tired after last night. Or perhaps you regret not choosing Moucheron. The poor girl tried so hard to please you, Delormeau remarked with a laugh. That can be remedied. Soon, my dear friend, you will grow to appreciate the delights of a merry life, full of new and ever-changing impressions. In my opinion, Prince, during your long travels you lived far too ascetically, devoting too much time to science and too little to real life. This must be corrected, and the best school for that is the company of artists and priestesses of free love. These women know how to live. Their refined taste gives a special touch of elegance to everything that surrounds them. I know that married women, that is, respectable women, or in other words, women with a limited outlook, for whom the whole world consists of housekeeping and children, look upon these dangerous enchantresses with contempt. In such surroundings, a man becomes frozen. After a long time, the boredom and melancholy of such a petty existence in a marital nest could turn anyone into an idiot. Are you married? To have such a poor opinion of married life? Supramati asked with a smile. The Viscount's face darkened. Alas, Prince, you have guessed it. I am married to a very naive boarding school girl who dreamed of eternal idols and made absurd demands. If she found a love note addressed to me from some woman with whom I maintained, by the way, the most innocent flirtation, she would faint, broadcast my villainy everywhere, and demand that I content myself with her company. How ridiculous! And she herself had not a trace of taste or chic. In vain did I try to correct her absurd upbringing and develop in her a sense of true refinement. I showed her in the theater the dresses and hairstyles, true models of chic and refined taste, advising her to imitate them. But great God, when I compared the copy with the original afterwards, I nearly choked with laughter. She simply lacked that elusive something that only artists possess. And so she began to hate the stage and despise the actresses I pointed out to her as examples, yet whom she had no ability to rival. Nevertheless, you will, of course, introduce me to the Viscountess? She was probably not at home yesterday, asked Supermati. What he heard disturbed him. Raised by a strictly moral mother, he found it barbaric to offer as an example to a respectable woman the manners and tastes of courtesans visited by her husband. The Viscountess is not in Paris. A few months after the birth of her daughter, she fled to Normandy to her relatives, who raised her. Her uncle, who died last year, was an old idiot with views from the time of Noah. His wife, a woman with the same backward notions, lives like an owl in her old castle filled with pious busybodies. My wife likes such company, and I do not require her return, for it is impossible to live with her. She spies on me, makes scenes, and forces me to hide like a thief. Now, thank God, for the third year I lead a bachelor's life, carefree and merry, allowing me to indulge my passion for music and dramatic art. But let us leave this dull subject, added the Viscount, taking Supermati's arm. If you like, I offer my help in purchasing some trinkets for Pierrette. After last night, this is almost obligatory. I do not intend to avoid this necessity and will be deeply grateful if you direct me to a good jeweler, replied Supermati, blushing slightly. In that case, I take this affair upon myself and will take you to a jeweler where one may acquire beautiful things at moderate prices. The Viscount showed remarkable zeal and first took the prince to the jeweler. He gave such excellent advice that the trinket purchase turned out to be a diamond parure worth 100,000 francs. In addition, in memory of the delightful evening spent together, Supermati bought 2 bracelets worth 5,000 francs each for the other ladies. Then, very satisfied with their purchases, they went to see Notre Dame Cathedral. Supermati did not know that the Viscount received a 10% commission on all the purchases he made, and that he dreamed of an endless series of equally brilliant profits in the future. A drunkard, a gambler, and an insatiable debauchee, the Viscount had long since squandered his fortune and everything he could seize from his wife's dowry. Ruined, pursued by creditors, but accustomed to living lavishly and denying himself nothing, he led a precarious existence, and the late Narayana had been for him a hen that laid golden eggs. The Viscount had managed to please the millionaire, who generously paid him for small services and lent him money he never demanded back. In addition, he managed to arrange for himself a considerable income from the commissions he received from the suppliers of flowers, jewels, sweets, and other things that the nabob used to present to the ladies favored by his whims. Supermati returned home rather early. Under the pretext that he needed to write several business letters, he refused to dine with Pierrette, who was delighted with the magnificent gift she had received. And indeed, The next morning, Supramati expected his notary and wanted to familiarize himself beforehand with the various documents he had found in Narayana's desk. Having reread and arranged the necessary papers, Supramati went to his study and laid down on the low, soft divan that had already become his favorite resting place. He intended to read a new novel recommended to him by the Viscount as one of the most interesting. But from the first pages, the vulgar immorality of the plot filled him with disgust, and Supramati, throwing the book aside, fell into thought. He felt a kind of painful sensation, not fatigue or physical indisposition, but deep dissatisfaction with himself. All his hard-working, pure, and religious past rose up against the dissoluteness and idleness that threatened to take possession of him. With strange clarity, the image of his late mother came to mind, that pious and gentle woman, a slave to her duty, who by example and word instilled in him the principles of straightforwardness, honesty in conduct, and strictness toward himself, principles that she herself followed and that for 30 years had guided his life. An extraordinary event had torn him from his simple and righteous life, throwing him into the whirlwind of endless existence and limitless wealth. But was it not his duty to use this colossal fortune to help others, rather than to toss money at lost creatures and gild their vices under the pretext of patronizing talent? And in such a time, when so much respectable poverty hides in sheds and attics, a tenth of what he had given Pierrette today could have saved an entire family from hardship and ruin. With contempt for himself, Supramati compared himself to a starving beggar who found a full purse of gold and greedily threw himself on all sorts of food, devouring even dishes he disliked. He remembered a poor fellow he had known as a student who had unexpectedly received a considerable inheritance. That man lost his head from pride and began to play the grand gentleman, forcing himself to eat what he loathed, dishes that made him nauseous, all just to show that he was accustomed to the most expensive and refined food. Morgan had once mercilessly mocked such ridiculous vanity, and now, was he not acting the same way, giving himself over to an orgy that had not even given him any real pleasure, but from which he feared to abstain in the future, lest he be considered stingy or provincial? His thoughts then turned to Narayana. That man had remained what he always had been, a drunkard and rake of Alexandria, whose own extravagance had driven him to poverty. Then necessity forced him to stop. But once he became immortal and a millionaire, he began again to revel and patronize courtesans, and only at times, tormented by satiety, he locked himself in one of his palaces to study occult sciences. But what had he actually learned? How had he used his knowledge? Had he used it for the benefit of humanity? Apparently not, for much had been said about his luxury, his generosity toward his mistresses, but not a word about his good deeds. And to crown it all, what a dark and bloody drama had ended his life. His reflections were interrupted by a muffled cry coming from the bedroom, which made him start. He straightened up and clearly heard the noise of overturned chairs, followed by the fall of a heavy body. Jumping from the divan, Supramati rushed into the bedroom, but saw nothing there. Everything was quiet and calm, and the soft light of the lamp revealed the order reigning everywhere. And yet he had no doubt the suspicious noise had come precisely from here. After carefully examining everything and finding nothing to explain what he had heard, Supramati reassured himself that it had been nothing more than an auditory hallucination and went to bed. He had not slept even a quarter of an hour when some indescribably unpleasant sensation made him wake instantly. An icy draft blew into his face, and it seemed to him that someone had entered the room. Shaking off his drowsiness, Supermati sat up in bed, his heart beating wildly. Leaning against a chiffonier stood a woman wearing only a white skirt. One hand was pressed to her side, and through her fingers, it seemed, thin streams of blood trickled. "Who are you? What do you want here?" Supermati asked in a commanding tone. At the sound of his voice, the woman turned. Her face was pale, her lips bluish and tightly pressed together, and her large eyes stared at him in terror. A moment later, the woman disappeared behind the chiffonier. But Supermati had seen enough. Despite the dreadful look of the death-like face and the confused gaze, he recognized in the night visitor the beautiful Liliana, the victim of Narayana. With a trembling hand, he turned the knob, and floods of electric light poured over the empty room. Yet the agitation he had endured was so great that he could no longer fall asleep until dawn. The impression of this nocturnal vision lasted through the following days, especially since twice more, at midnight, the same invisible crime seemed to repeat itself. A muffled cry and the rattle of agony rang out, followed by the fall of a body and the crash of overturned furniture, after which dead silence returned. The bedroom began to inspire in Supermati a sense of dread, but ashamed of his own cowardice and afraid of seeming ridiculous before the servants by abandoning the luxurious room without any apparent reason, he did not dare change it. To avoid the fatal hour, Supermati began going out often and returning very late, allowing the Viscount to drag him from one place of amusement to another. Chapter 6. One morning, a week after the nocturnal vision, Supermati went down into the garden for his early walk. It was a splendid autumn day, breathing in the pure, invigorating air with delight. He, for the first time, made a thorough inspection of his estate. He saw that on both sides of the house, as well as before the facade, the garden occupied a vast space, but that behind the palace it stretched only in a narrow strip. On this side, the railing was replaced by a very high wall. Here, in this corridor, thick shrubs grew. Nevertheless, surprised by such an arrangement, Supermati went in, wishing to know whether the two halves of the garden communicated. They did not, for the wall, making a turn, joined directly to the house. Glancing upward by chance, Supermati saw two windows almost entirely hidden by dense greenery and with their shutters lowered. He did not remember ever having seen a half-dark room with windows facing the wall. At first, he could not at all determine where such an unknown room could be located, and only after long reflection did he conclude that it must be next to his bedroom, although in the wall between them there was no door. A suspicion began to form that this was Narayana's secret retreat, and that to avoid seeing the bare wall, he had planted chestnut trees before it. Deeply intrigued, Supermati returned to the house and made a careful inspection of his bedroom. The memory of the nocturnal vision inspired the thought that perhaps it was in this room that Narayana had hidden the corpse of his victim, and that the entrance to it was concealed behind the chiffonier. But despite all his searching, he found nothing. In the evening, he could not fall asleep, nor had he the patience to read. The windows of the mysterious room would not leave his thoughts. He cast aside the journal and leaned back on the pillows. The light of the lamp was reflected on the slightly darkened gold of the wallpaper. Suddenly, his wandering gaze stopped on a brighter point at the center of a large blossom. Mechanically, he lifted his hand toward the shining point and started. It was a small metallic button. He leapt up and began pressing and moving the button, supposing it to conceal a spring. He was not mistaken. The button yielded beneath his pressure, and a piece of the wall, hidden in the hangings so that it was impossible to detect, slid noiselessly aside on invisible hinges. An opening appeared, beyond which all was so dark that nothing could be distinguished. "This is the secret room whose windows I saw," thought Supramati as he hastily put on his slippers and threw on his dressing gown. He burned with the desire to see Narayana's hiding place and whatever he kept there. From Nara, he knew that the hotel had belonged to the deceased since the time of the great king Louis XIV, during whose minority he had bought it and furnished it according to his own taste and needs. Supramati lit a flame and entered the secret room, the entrance to which was closed by a thick portiere. He found himself in a room of moderate size, furnished in the most refined Rococo style. Blue silk, strewn with garlands of flowers and little cupids, covered the walls. The floor was hidden beneath an aubusson carpet on a white ground scattered with roses. Opposite the entrance, between the windows, stood a small writing table of exquisite workmanship, inlaid with gold and mother of pearl. Above it hung a portrait of Narayana in the luxurious costume of the time of Louis XV. He wore an emerald green coat and a lace jabot. His hair was powdered. One hand rested on the golden hilt of a slender sword, and from beneath the lace of his broad cuff gleamed, like a drop of blood, the mysterious ring of the Brotherhood of the Grail. In this splendid costume, Narayana was enchantingly handsome. Something demonic flashed in his black eyes. Supramati admired for a moment the classic features of his predecessor's face, then, with a deep sigh, turned away and began examining the room. Great disorder reigned there. A chair lay overturned. An open casket was on the carpet, and on the desk, evidently in the dark, various papers had been scattered. Supramati lit the candles in the candelabra and passed into the adjoining room, much smaller than the first. It was a lady's boudoir, with a dressing table adorned with magnificent lace and a mirror in a gilt enamel frame. The walls and furniture were covered with white satin embroidered in gold. The hangings of the bed, which stood on a dais covered with a fur carpet, were of the same material. The bed was in disorder, the pillows thrown about, and the coverlet lay on the floor, stained with blood. On the white carpet, near a large dark stain marking what had evidently been a pool of blood, stood a silver cup filled with a blackish liquid that gave off an unpleasant, nauseating odor. At the foot of the bed, a half-open door led into a small antechamber, and from there to a staircase covered with carpet. Both were lit by lamps, now extinguished. At the bottom of the stairs was a door with a key left in the lock. Supramati opened it and looked out. Before him stretched a narrow lane bordered on both sides by walls, but he did not investigate further and went back upstairs. Once more examining the boudoir, he found at the head of the bed another door concealed by a portiere. It was locked and no key was in it. After vain attempts to open or break it, Supramati began looking for something he might insert into the keyhole to force the lock. Finding nothing suitable in the boudoir, he returned to the sitting room and saw on the table a long, sturdy knife whose presence in the room he could not explain. However, he did not ponder this long, for he was eager to penetrate beyond that door. A presentiment told him he would find further proof of the crime there. After several efforts, the lock gave way and the door opened. A wave of cold air, saturated with a suffocating odor, struck him so forcefully in the face that his head swam and he recoiled. The sensation, however, quickly passed. Supramati raised the candle, crossed the threshold, and froze, staring in bewilderment at a long box resembling a coffin, entirely covered with black cloth on which lay an enormous garland of flowers so fresh they seemed just plucked. At the ends of the box stood 4 silver sconces of ancient design, in which lamps still burned with a faint bluish flame. By the flickering light of the candle, this funerary chamber had a sinister aspect, and a shiver of superstitious fear ran through Supermati as he looked around. At the back of the room, he saw a bath, and near it a marble bench on which lay blood-stained linen and a small vessel with sponges. For a moment, he struggled with the superstitious terror that had seized him, then resolutely approached the box. He had to know at last what it held, and nothing would prevent him from reporting his discovery to the authorities on the morrow. He examined the black funerary cloth embroidered in silver with Kabbalistic signs. Then, with an unsteady hand, he attempted to lift it. The cloth immediately slid down as from a polished surface and fell to the floor. With a stifled cry, he recoiled, nearly dropping the candle. Before him stood a crystal coffin, and within, on a white silk mattress, lay a woman in a flowing white peignoir. Her head rested on a lace-trimmed pillow. It was the original of the miniature, the beautiful Liliana. But now her appearance was not as dreadful and distorted as in the nocturnal vision. Despite her alabaster pallor, the body did not give the impression of death, but seemed fresh and supple, like that of a sleeping woman. Her small, slightly parted lips bore the trace of suffering. Long black lashes cast shadows on her transparent cheeks, and one hand lay peacefully on her breast. The wound was not visible. It was hidden beneath the folds of the batiste. Moreover, from her waist to her feet, her body was covered, as if with a veil, with roses, violets, lilies, and other fragrant blossoms, beautiful and fresh as though newly gathered in the garden. Spellbound, Supermati gazed at the lovely being, and bending nearer to study Liliana more closely, he saw that she was immersed in a colorless liquid filling the crystal coffin to the top. What was this liquid that preserved not only the human body, but flowers with their hues and vitality? It was a secret, just as mysterious as why Neriana kept here the body of the woman he had slain and seemed unable to outlive. Pensive and shaken, Supermati turned away and approached the bench to inspect what lay upon it. Suddenly he stepped on something, bent down, and picked it up. He recognized a vial like the one he possessed, containing the Elixir of Life. The discovery revealed what had happened. After striking the young woman down, Neriana had attempted to save her by means of the vital essence. But why had he failed? Had the help come too late? Or did he not know all the properties of the mysterious fluid nor the manner of using it in such a case? The disorder in the room proved that Neriana had acted in haste, not troubling to set things right afterward or erase the clear traces of his crime. Passing through the boudoir, Supermati noticed on a chair near the bed a white waistcoat soaked in blood. Evidently, he had first brought his victim there. Agitated, Supermati sat at the writing table and looked at the portrait of his predecessor, wondering how a man initiated into such extraordinary mysteries could have been driven to commit a vile murder. Then he examined the papers scattered over the table. There lay a thick notebook in binding like the one he had found in Venice, treating of occult knowledge, as well as a heap of trivial letters, bills from suppliers, blank paper and envelopes, and a half-written sheet, the lower part of which had apparently been drenched by an overturned inkstand, as shown by the black stain on the pale blue cloth. Glancing absent-mindedly at the first lines, Supermati became interested in this page. It was a draft of a letter by Neriana. "Master, I have killed her, And this proves that despite the inexhaustible life force flowing in my veins, I am as contemptible a slave of the flesh as other men. I was enraged. How dared she prefer another to me? I, no common fellow. Besides, had I not done everything to ensure her happiness? Shaking, he turned the knob, and floods of electric light filled the empty room. But the shock he had just endured was so great that he could no longer fall asleep until dawn. The impression left by that night vision lasted through all the following days, especially because twice more at midnight, the invisible crime seemed to repeat itself. A muffled cry and the rattle of agony would ring out, followed by the fall of a body and the crash of overturned furniture, and then everything sank again into dead silence. The bedroom began to inspire Supermati with horror, but ashamed of his own cowardice and afraid of seeming ridiculous before the servants by abandoning his luxurious room without any apparent reason, he could not bring himself to change chambers. To avoid the fatal hour, Supermati started going out constantly and returning very late, letting the Viscount drag him from one entertainment to another. With time, she would inevitably grow old and die, and then all bonds would break on their own. But he had not thought of this. That was not Nara, who was the same as he was. With her, they could always love each other. But that was not what he wanted to speak to you about, Master. He wanted to save Liliana and ran for the flask, but when he returned with it, she was already motionless. He had heard that wounds close if you pour that liquid on them, and he tried it, but the result was entirely different. He did not know whether she was alive or dead, but in her death-like stillness, she seemed alive, though nothing could dispel that state. The body was soft and flexible. No icy coldness of death emanated from it, and yet not the slightest sign of life remained. What was he to do, Master, until you came to help and explain all this? He felt a terrible uneasiness. He had stained his hands with the unclean blood of this woman. Before your arrival, Master, he had tried another remedy used to preserve in flowers the sap of life and protect them from withering. He had used it more than once, and by giving away several such immortal flowers, had earned a reputation as a mage. So he immersed Liliana, alive or dead, he did not know, into that substance, since there was the breath of life that could be detected. O great and mighty Master, you will tell me this otherwise. There the letter broke off. Had he written another, or had some unforeseen event prevented him from finishing it? Then he had departed never to return, and all these questions remained unanswered. Great God, into what labyrinth of mysteries have I fallen? Murmured Supermati, hiding the letter in the pocket of his robe. Extinguishing the candles in the candelabra, he returned to his own room and carefully closed the panel. Still, he could not bring himself to sleep in such close proximity to the dead, and withdrawing to his study, he laid down on the couch. Thoughts whirled through his mind. First of all, he remembered his intention to inform the authorities of the crime committed. But had he the right to do so? Here the mysterious essence played a part. Would he not violate the statutes of the Brotherhood to which he belonged if he delivered even the smallest particle of a dangerous secret into profane hands? After mature reflection, he decided to remain silent about his discovery until the matter was clarified to him by one of the competent members of the Brotherhood. Then he pondered another strange circumstance. How could Narayana be so ignorant of the properties and use of the dreadful substance he possessed? Why had he not learned to use it? Who was the mysterious teacher to whom he appealed? Dahir or Ahasver? At that moment, he felt a passionate desire to have one of the initiated near him, and his thoughts flew intensely to the Temple of the Grail, to that old man he had seen performing the sacrament. Suddenly, a wave of warm, fragrant air enveloped him, and someone's voice, coming from nowhere, spoke distinctly though somewhat hollowly. Narayana was a rake and an idler who used his vitality only for pleasure and the satisfaction of his passions. He barely touched the mysteries, never penetrating them. He had neither patience nor the goodwill to delve into the realm of higher knowledge. He climbed only the first steps of initiation and remained a slave to base instincts. He surrounded himself with spirits of darkness who ruled him, but he could not subdue them. His end was worthy of his life. One cannot with impunity hold the greatest secret of cosmic laws, the secret of the preservation of life, and use it like a schoolboy to satisfy whims. Whoever possesses this primordial matter must tirelessly study it, learning all its properties and modes of action. As the last words were spoken, the voice gradually weakened and then fell silent in the distance. Suparmati was as if frozen. The immediate communication with an invisible being and the answer to his mental question sent a shiver of superstitious terror through him. Little by little, he calmed himself and convinced his mind that he must grow accustomed to such phenomena now that circumstances forced him to enter the occult world hidden from ordinary mortals in the transparent ether. And he wished to penetrate it as quickly as possible, striving with all his strength to study it so as not to remain as ignorant as Narayana. All sleep had left him, and sitting at his writing desk, he opened a notebook he had found in Narayana's secret room. On the first page was written, Preface, excerpt from the great book, translated for the newly initiated. The great mysteries of the arcana of occult science cannot be revealed in their fullness in the language of the profane. The true student who studies their essence must know the esoteric language, the language that explains the formulas and true meaning of the mysterious signs. This book is written for the beginner, unable yet to decipher the signs of the sacred language, but who needs the first initiation in order to be able to orient himself and not become completely lost. Otherwise, the seven seals will never fall for him. For one who has received the essence of life, which, like an inexhaustible spring, constantly renews his vital forces, the first and greatest duty is to study this mysterious and powerful juice that animates all that breathes. This juice is the primordial matter, the blood of the immense organism called the universe flowing through its arteries like the stream of life. This juice exists in cosmic and organic mixtures. This king of gases, touching matter, warms it like flame and makes it live. Like a heart, it throbs in the center of planets. For billions of years, it has created, nourished, and clothed worlds. And when, through the exchange of forces with other cosmic powers, the sap of life is absorbed and its last breath departs, all collapses, disperses, and transforms into other forms. For people and beings constantly born and transformed on the great cosmic body they inhabit, the lamp of life burns quickly, since the pure essence is not introduced into their bodies, but is transmitted only slightly by generation. Yet this mysterious sap of life can be extracted from chaos in the form of a pure essence, and so applied to humans. This primordial creative force, the mightiest of gases, has thousands of wondrous properties unknown to humanity and unused by it. Whoever can apply all the properties of the primordial matter will reach the great arcanum of the uncreated light and become master of the seven virtues of the prism. The successive lives on planets throughout their hierarchy are hardly enough to study the laws of primordial matter. Great is he who possesses the ability to extract it in pure form from cosmic chaos. Yet he remains an ignoramus if, possessing it, he fails to use the countless forces and properties of this proteus of space, which appears and disappears. Changeable, elusive, yet terrible in its creative and destructive power, it remains a mystery of strange and diverse laws that no mortal has yet comprehended. And man passes blindly and vainly by that great breath of life of the eternal. Earlier, it was said that primordial matter, once introduced into an organism, grants it an inexhaustible source of life, long as planetary life. But everyone who has tasted this primordial sap, born of the eternal uncreated motion, must regard himself as a student of the great mystery flowing in his veins, which he must study according to his strength and never remain idle, using his exceptional position only to satisfy his animal instincts. You yourself, O man, are a microscopic world, and your mind is capable of contemplating the universe. Therefore, work, and you will cease to be blind. You will see through the darkness surrounding you, and with the ear of the soul, hear the voice of the spheres. The dread power hidden within you will be either your ally or your tyrant. It will give you the wings of knowledge and light 7 flames upon your brow, or it will cast you down to the level of the animal, and you will suffer eternally from unfulfilled desires. The inexhaustible source of life will either burn within you with a pure flame, granting you the bliss of the mage, or will make of you a demon and hand you over to demons. The bright hosts of good, as well as the legions of darkness, will strive to draw you to themselves. Forget not that you live in a chaotic world where evil reigns. Therefore, learn to understand the great magical symbols to command the crowd around you, and to wield the magical sword. For woe to you if you are defeated. Learn to rule sounds, apply light, and discern aromas. Learn to govern the magnetic currents emanating from beings and things, and to conquer darkness with light. Then you will be strong and invincible, for only the ignorant and the lazy are weak. The great book of laws is open to anyone who wishes to study it. Who is to blame if blind and ignorant people pass by, mocking the signs that cover its radiant pages simply because they do not understand them? They resemble foolish children who refuse to learn the alphabet that could open to them a whole world of knowledge. They do not realize that one who cannot read is condemned to ignorance for life. Supramati stopped after reading the last line of that short introduction. What he had read was enough to absorb all his thoughts. Would he have the strength to fulfill worthily the vast program now open before him? Narayana had clearly failed his task, forgetting that it is dangerous to play with forces whose workings are only half known. He had fallen victim to the fatal chance he himself provoked and could not master. And thus some unknown law led him to destruction despite the powers invested in him. A sigh, or was it a groan, escaped Supramati's lips. His head swam at the thought of a life as long as a planetary life. He was afraid of himself, afraid of the mystery pressing on him from all sides. With painful clarity there rose before him the evening when the mysterious stranger had appeared to him. He recalled the fear and disgust death had then inspired in him, and the vague bitterness he had felt at the sight of healthy and happy people enjoying all the blessings of life. Now he possessed everything. All the pleasures of life lay at his feet, yet they had strangely lost their value for him. However, this oppressed state did not last long. The clear and energetic mind of the young scholar bravely cast it off. The path was marked. He had to follow it, for he wanted to be master of the situation and to see clearly. Only after undergoing initiation would he appear on the arena of life. Not like Narayana, to indulge in vulgar material pleasures, but to help with his acquired knowledge his unfortunate brothers. He would distribute his gold not to some Piorettas, who always find generous admirers anyway, but to the destitute whom no one cares about and whom the wealthy avoid, afraid to soil their hands. A whole procession of distressing scenes of poverty that he had encountered during his medical career rose in his memory. Attics and cellars where entire families and little children languished in cold and hunger, their innocent eyes seemingly asking why cruel fate had caused them to be born only for suffering. A passionate desire to know, to heal, and to help filled Supramati's heart. The pure fire of compassion burned within him, and he no longer feared laboring, even an entire planetary lifetime, upon the vast battlefield of human sorrow. The next day, the Viscount arrived for breakfast and, as always, brought what he considered the most interesting program for the day. This time it involved meeting a charming Spaniard, Rosita. She's a real gem, a true hummingbird. I warn you, Prince, you'll be crazy about her, added Lormel, fervently kissing the tips of his fingers. But Supramati's soul still echoed with the exaltation of the previous night, and he looked with barely concealed contempt at this selfish libertine who had cast aside the duties of husband and father to lead a life of shame and idleness backstage and in courtesans' boudoirs. Interrupting the stream of praise the Viscount showered upon the beautiful Rosita, Supramati asked, "Can you point out to me a few truly needy families who do not stretch out their hands for alms, but, being victims of undeserved misfortune, die in silence?" A few such visits would, in my opinion, be far more interesting than the company of demimonde ladies, all more or less alike, and who will always find sympathetic souls ready to feast and entertain them. For a moment, the Viscount stood with his mouth open. Such ideas from the nabob he intended to exploit displeased him greatly, but he was too clever and too shrewd to show his annoyance. He limited himself to bursting into loud laughter. "You may boast, Prince, that you've absolutely astonished me. I never expected you to take up philanthropy. Still, it's just another fancy like any other. Since it's come over you, it's easy to satisfy it without denying yourself the little joys of life. Thank God, Paris has no shortage of beggars. My friendship for you is so great that I'm ready to introduce you to one person who lives in that world. A half-witted woman who runs from morning to night through cellars and attics with a bag filled with alms she extorts from anyone unfortunate enough to meet her. Madame Rosalie will show you a real cabinet of curiosities. Those idlers who instead of working want to live at the expense of public charity see her as an angel. They count on the generosity of naive people who, pitying their poverty, fail to see their parasitism." The Viscount fell silent, slightly embarrassed by the dark and stern look of his companion. "You are very harsh toward the poor, my friend. But tell me honestly, if we look closely, aren't we also idlers who want to live well and do nothing? What useful work do we spend our time on? We ride in carriages, eat magnificent dinners drenched in champagne, amuse ourselves with courtesans, spend evenings in theaters, and end the day with some refined debauchery. The only difference between us and the poor idlers, if they even are idlers, is that we have the means to pay for these pleasures and they lack the necessities. You compare yourself with such riffraff, but they are also human beings and have the same needs and desires as we do, replied Supermati. But back to the matter. You will greatly oblige me, Viscount, if you introduce me to the lady you mentioned, or better yet, take me to her. I am a man with no occupation and have no right to waste the time of this respectable woman, whose every hour is filled with good deeds. The Viscount grimaced, but immediately laughed again. Slapping Supermati on the shoulder, he said jokingly, "Oh, these nabobs, they always have some eccentric fantasy. Still, charity is as much an amusement as any other, and I'll gladly fulfill your wish." An hour later, the prince's landau stopped in the suburbs before a modest little house. They entered a small, poorly furnished room where Rosalie was finishing her modest breakfast. Surprised by the visit of elegant young men, she rose to greet them. She was a tall woman of about 35, thin and pale, with gentle blue eyes expressing endless kindness. She blushed slightly when the Viscount introduced Prince Supermati and added that he wished to take part in her charitable work. Rosalie had no idea she stood before a millionaire. Naturally, any benefactor was a welcome guest, which she expressed in simple and heartfelt words. The poor are so many, but thanks be to God, there is no shortage of generous hearts ready to help their brothers, she added with a light sigh. I indeed, madam, long to help my unfortunate brothers, not with trifles, but in the most radical way. Therefore, I've come to you, asking you to indicate families worthy of support. O Prince, may the Lord bless your generosity. As for families worthy of your kindness, you need only choose, Rosalie said joyfully. There is, for example, a widow with 6 children whose husband was killed in a railway accident. The poor woman has just recovered from typhus, and now the entire family is dying of hunger. Then a young girl, a complete orphan, who with her work supports and raises her brother and 2 little sisters. She engraved wood and embroidered artistically, but due to exhausting night work, she developed inflammation in her eyes and may go blind. Oh, I repeat, you only need to choose. The list of unhappy and destitute beings is immense, their aching hearts needing consolation as much as their bodies need food and clothing. But the saddest are those who have fallen into despair, who have complained against God's justice and doubt his mercy. And it is often the most honest and best people who fall into such moral darkness when ruin invades their homes and they are forced to sell items, clothes, and little trinkets dear to them as memories of some distant happiness. Rosalie's voice carried such deep and genuine compassion that Supermati was moved and said with a kind smile, "You are right, madam. So let us hasten to bring a little light and hope into this darkness of despair. If you allow me, I will accompany you, and in my carriage we can visit far more places." Embarrassed, Rosalie put on her hat and gloves. When she tried to take her basket of provisions and a bundle of old clothes, Supermati stopped her. "Leave that, madam. I will provide money for new clothing." Then he turned to the Viscount, who listened while biting his mustache, not interfering, and told him he would come to dinner as arranged, but would spend the rest of the day differently. Sitting in a magnificent carriage beside a young and handsome man who overwhelmed her with his wealth and title, the simple and modest Rosalie at first felt very ill at ease. But Supermati's conversation soon dispelled her discomfort. When she saw that the young man faithfully followed her through beggars' dwellings, breathed without disgust the heavy, damp air of dark corridors, and tirelessly climbed steep, narrow staircases, she began to see him as a benevolent spirit. And indeed, everywhere Supermati appeared, he brought hope, joy, and strength to live. Check after check passed into trembling hands of the unfortunate, long unaccustomed to any joy. And the assistance he offered was not accidental or temporary. No, he brought entire fortunes that ensured families a decent existence and gave them the opportunity to rise and begin anew. Never had Supermati seen so many tears of joy or heard so many blessings. Seeing faith and hope rekindling in the hearts of the destitute and resentful, Supermati felt that the immense wealth he possessed was truly an invaluable gift. When he took leave of Rosalie, they had already become friends. If you ever need to ask me for anything for your poor, feel free to come to me. I'm always at home for you. Or better yet, write so that I may come to you when needed. In addition, I will assign a monthly sum that you will receive from my notary and spend at your discretion, he said. How shall I thank you for your kindness? Said Rosalie, tears in her eyes. There is nothing to thank me for. Supermati replied with a laugh. I give only a little gold, of which I have more than I could spend. True mercy is on your side, for you give your time and labor and provide moral support that often saves a person from some desperate act. He returned home happy, cheerful, and content as he had not been in a long time. He dined alone, then lay on his favorite couch and pondered what he had seen and felt that day. It seemed to him that he had acted in accordance with the law of harmony that brings happiness to man, for he knew from experience that doing good brings inner satisfaction and joy incomparable to anything else. So there exists a fluidic law that rewards virtue and compassion with the priceless blessing of a satisfied conscience. Yes, he murmured, I must study these laws and understand why good creates harmony and evil, discord. The following days passed in the usual entertainments arranged by the Viscount. Pierrette chased Supermati everywhere she could, using the most desperate coquetry to finally conquer him. She would have been greatly surprised to know that he sometimes thought, looking at her, poor toy of luxury and vice. Do you never think of the poverty or death in a hospital that awaits you when your beauty, your current merchandise, fades? One evening the Viscount, with his mistress, and Supermati with Pierrette were cheerfully ending the day in a fashionable restaurant. Pierrette, who already regarded herself as the young rich man's chief lover, grew ever bolder and more demanding. By the end of dinner, the large amount of champagne she had consumed rushed to her head and drove her shamelessness to its limits. After singing a lively chansonette, to which the Viscount wildly applauded, Pierrette, not noticing Supermati's lack of admiration, began asking him for a reward. Then she added that it was time for him to buy her a hotel, especially since earlier that morning she had seen in the newspaper an advertisement for a magnificent house for sale at a bargain price. What are 5 or 600,000 francs to you? For me, it's a fortune. You must secure my future, she finished, stroking his cheek. A mysterious smile crossed Supermati's lips. You're right. I must secure your future, and I already have. Only instead of buying you a hotel, I deposited capital in a bank. The interest from this capital will form a solid pension that will be paid out when you turn 45, when you are too old to work and your admirers abandon you. You will indeed need a refuge where you may rest and repent of the sins of your youth. Pierrette turned terribly pale and did not take her eyes off him. You're mocking me, of course? She asked hesitantly. Not at all. On the contrary, I repeat with complete seriousness that if your admirers, instead of dressing you up, thought about providing you with a peaceful old age, there would not be so many priestesses of pleasure dying in poverty in some attic corner or in a hospital. While you are young and beautiful, Perrette, you will never lack people who will love you and adorn you. But when you grow old, when no one desires you anymore, you will appreciate the pension I am leaving you. Perrette's pallor instantly turned into a bright blush, and with a blazing look, she jumped to her feet. Planting herself before Supermati and placing her fists on her hips, she exclaimed, "Do you know, you savage, that you are very insolent? I'm not asking you to secure my old age. Who knows whether I will even live to such years? After such an insult, I no longer love you, you miser, you Indian cannibal." Her voice trembled with anger. The Viscount and his beauty burst out laughing. Supermati, however, did not seem the least offended by such insulting epithets. With a courteous smile, he took from his wallet a folded sheet of paper and handed it to the young woman. "Do not be ungrateful, my dear. The day will come when my gift today will be very, very useful. Take it and hide this document, or at least remember the place from which you will, in due time, be able to draw means for an honest and peaceful life." Perrette was beside herself with fury and stood as if petrified. After waiting a moment, Supermati opened his wallet again and was already about to put the deed back when suddenly the actress, like a panther, leapt at him, tore the document from his hand, and hid it in her bodice. "Miser, thrice miser," she said with contempt. "Your late brother Narayana was a knight. He would never have bothered with such petty ideas. He showered gold and diamonds upon the women he loved, whose youth and beauty intoxicated him, and he never preached at them like a Trappist, remembered death, nor conjured before them the repulsive specter of old age. But I am not preventing you, dear Perrette, from exchanging me for a more knightly and generous admirer," Supermati remarked calmly. Graceful and supple as a kitten, Perrette threw herself at him and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him on both cheeks. "Monster, if I didn't love you, of course I would show you the door. When my heart speaks, money is a trifle to me. As for the insult, does not true love endure and forgive everything?" Peace was concluded amid the Homeric laughter of all present, Perrette herself included. Chapter 7. Supermati returned home late, as had become his habit ever since the presence of the dead woman forced him to abandon his bedroom. He was not tired, but his soul was heavy. Despite his decision to taste all of life's pleasures and drain the cup of delight before taking up the cup of knowledge, as the old high priest of the Grail Palace had told him, he could not bring himself to enjoy the crude entertainments of the suspicious society around him. All these principleless idlers, aristocrats who had squandered their nobility, swindlers waiting for handouts, and finally the depraved and greedy women sometimes filled him with real disgust, and he felt an ever-growing desire to flee from this company of drunkards, gamblers, and revelers. With amazement, he asked himself how Narayana could spend months in such surroundings and absorb them so deeply that he had become capable of murder. Liliana's murder remained an impenetrable mystery to him. Could Narayana have felt jealousy toward a woman who sold herself, something he knew, and whose virtue or fidelity it would have been madness to rely upon? A man with the experience of many centuries behind him could not be carried away like a schoolboy. Evidently, there was some enigma here, but would he ever be able to unravel it? That night, Supermati felt all these unpleasant impressions with special sharpness. The memory of Perrette and the empty, vulgar conversations, saturated with cynical expressions and greasy anecdotes, was unbearably repugnant to him, and suddenly a passionate longing flared within him for the harmony reigning in the palace of the Grail. He felt that his soul urgently needed peace, silence, and solitude so it could concentrate, think freely about the great problems he was destined to resolve, and finally study the two notebooks left to him by Narayana. Ralph Morgan by nature had been a worker. Despite his frail health and many official duties, he was always engaged in intellectual labor, writing scholarly dissertations and reading everything new that appeared in his field. Having become Prince Supremati and feeling strong and healthy as never before, he had turned into an idle sluggard, and such a state was becoming unbearable to him. No, he had to flee this noisy Paris, flee this gang of vulgar scoundrels, and transport himself into another environment. Yes, he would go, and tomorrow. The thought of the Viscount's disappointment and of all the charming people who feasted at his expense brought him malicious pleasure. Estimating what gifts and a farewell banquet would cost him, he placed the same amount into an envelope addressed to Madame Rosalie. Having finished this, he rang and, ordering his small suitcase brought, told them to pack the most necessary things before his eyes. He wanted not only to leave Paris on the 6 o'clock morning train, but also to go alone, without the curious and ill-disposed servants. He wished to become once more as independent, free, and unnoticed a traveler as before. Informing the steward that he was leaving for 2 weeks and taking no one with him, he ordered himself driven to the station. With an indescribable feeling of well-being, he sat down in his first-class compartment. Thank God, today the Viscount would not bother him with his absurd program or drag him through all sorts of debauchery. He would no longer see the pale, exhausted faces of all those slaves of vice who had fastened themselves to him like leeches. The question remained, where to go? The choice was enormous. From the list left by Narayana, more than 50 estates, castles, and villas were named, scattered across all countries of the world. Supremati unfolded this list and began to study it, admiring the orderly method of the inventory. Next to each property were noted the time of its acquisition, what capital it represented, the amount of income it produced, and the date of Narayana's last visit to the villa, castle, or estate. A special note indicated where the inventory and results of a last inspection were hidden, as well as the location of a secret cache where capital in gold and precious stones was stored, in case money could not be obtained from a bank. Indeed, Narayana was an excellent administrator. He spent much, but he did not like being robbed, Supremati thought with a smile. I must follow his example. His foresight is worthy of imitation and shows how many financial difficulties he went through. I must, while I am free, inspect at least part of my estates. But where to start with such a vast choice? Supremati read through the list of European estates again. Among them was an old castle located on the bank of the Rhine. On it he fixed his choice. That must be very interesting, he thought. I love these old feudal nests, clinging to rocks like falcons. They breathe antiquity, and legends surround them with a poetic aura. Narayana has owned this castle for 3 centuries already, and that is enough guarantee that no major modern alterations have been made. Decided, I am going there. Upon arriving in Cologne, he boarded a steamer and continued toward his destination. He had to disembark in a rarely visited area where the steamer stopped only at passengers' special request. Having stepped ashore, Supremati found himself near a small village whose pretty houses peeped through the yellowing leaves of half-bare trees. Further on, Atop a steep cliff that seemed completely inaccessible rose a small castle with thick turrets, surrounded by a crenellated wall with a drawbridge. In the village, Supramati asked whether someone could guide him to the castle and carry his suitcase. An old peasant who was repairing a barrel agreed to fulfill the stranger's request. It was a marvelous November day. The fresh air was pure and fragrant. In the best of spirits, Supramati climbed the narrow, steep road leading to the castle. The peasant soon tired of the foreigner's silence and struck up a conversation in order to find out whether the traveler might be a relative of the steward. Supramati, for his part, made use of this talk to gather information about the castle's inhabitants. There's a steward, a cook, 2 footmen, a housekeeper, and my niece Anchin, the scullery maid. Through her I know perfectly everything that goes on in that old nest of ghosts, the peasant said. Ah, so there are ghosts? How very curious. Supramati remarked. Naturally, every old hovel has ghosts, and here both the master and the steward have dealings with the devil. Good heavens! And how do you know that? Oh, that's clear to everyone. First of all, the master bears such a devilish name that it's impossible to pronounce. 10 years ago he left, and no one knows where he is now. Back then he lived here for 3 years, and no one saw him. Some say he is young and handsome, others that he is old. When he left, he took his footmen with him, and now, except for the steward, the whole staff is new. The steward is also a very strange person. He is so sullen and silent that he almost never speaks, and when not inspecting the castle, he sits shut up in his room. He must be very old, at least 90, for he arrived here in my grandfather's time. Yet he still looks so vigorous that you wouldn't give him more than 50. He looks now exactly as he did the day he arrived. And you understand yourself that only with the help of Satan can one avoid aging. I confess that reason does not convince me, and I do not at all consider a vigorous old age a gift of Satan. I see at once, sir, that you're not from here, and that's why you are so unbelieving. But we understand very well what's what. Not long ago, the devil pulled such a trick that everyone knows of it. I learned of it from Anchin, who is very truthful and never lies. Well, what happened? You see, in the castle there's an old chapel, from which, through a door that is always locked, one can reach the little tower where, apparently, a bell hangs. And suddenly, 3 months ago, in the middle of the night, this bell began to ring. Everyone panicked and ran to the chapel. It was locked as always, and meanwhile the bell kept pealing loudly. Anchin swore to me she had never in her life heard such a soul-tearing sound. It was as though wounded and dying people were groaning in chorus. The steward also ran there. He was terribly pale and brought a bunch of keys with him. With trembling hands, he opened the chapel, and, imagine, all the candles on the altar were burning. The old man fell to his knees and began to pray, but the rest scattered and wanted to quit their positions. However, they later reconsidered and yielded to the steward's persuasion, who called them fools, and they stayed, for the wages are very good, and the work almost none. Supramati listened to this tale with vivid curiosity. The nighttime event the guide spoke of must have foretold Narayana's death, a fact strange in itself, but nothing surprised Supramati anymore, since he had entered this fantastical world. They finally reached the platform on which the castle stood. On this side, it was surrounded by a wide moat, and the drawbridge was lowered, but the gates were locked. We must ring the bell, then they will open, the peasant said. When Supramati paid him generously and tried to dismiss him, the peasant declared that since he had climbed all the way up, he wished to see his niece. They rang. A few minutes later, a small window opened and the stern voice of an old servant said, without much friendliness, "Who are you? What do you want?" "Tourists are not shown the castle. Call the steward and tell him that I come in the name of his master." Supremati replied with a peculiar note of command. A few minutes later, the large gates opened with a clang, and a man in black came quickly toward them. "You come in the name of the master, sir? Welcome," he said with a respectful bow. "Lead me to the prince's study." "I must speak with you," Supremati answered, examining the steward closely. He was a tall, strong man of about 50. Gray streaks showed in his hair and beard, yet the fresh color of his face, the brightness of his small gray eyes, and the lightness of his movements gave him a much younger appearance. The steward walked ahead respectfully, showing the visitor the way. They passed through a small paved courtyard whose high walls gave it a gloomy appearance, and then through a large hall that had evidently once served as an armory. Judging by its architecture, the castle dated back to the 12th or 13th century. The walls were extraordinarily thick, the ceilings low, and the narrow windows deep set like arrow slits. The furnishings matched the general aspect. Carved blackened oak covered the walls. The furniture was heavy and massive. In a large hall whose walls were decorated with ancient portraits and weapons, Supremati stopped and, placing his hand on the steward's shoulder, said, "I have not come in the name of your former master, but in my own. I am Narayana Supremati, younger brother and sole heir of the late prince. You must know that he is dead, for the chapel bell rang on the night of his passing." The old steward looked at him in bewilderment. "Yes, I know, but can it truly be that he died? He who was never supposed to die," he murmured. Then, quickly recovering himself, he seized Supremati's hand and kissed it with deep reverence. "Welcome, my lord, and may God bless your entrance beneath this roof. Everything is ready for your arrival, just as everything was always ready for him whenever he came unexpectedly." Supremati looked with amazement at the man standing before him, in whose eyes he noticed that same subtle, elusive gleam he had seen in the members of their mysterious brotherhood. "Why did you believe Narayana would not die like other men?" he asked. "How could I not know? I serve him even in the time of the Crusades. The Lord forgot me, as he forgot him among men," the steward replied with a sigh. "Now that he has finally died, I hope my turn will come. But when? We shall speak of it in detail later, and you will tell me your story, my old friend. For now, take me to the room occupied by my late brother, and have breakfast brought if possible." The apartments usually occupied by Narayana consisted of 3 rooms, one of which served as a library and opened into one of the towers. It was a large circular hall lit by stained glass windows. The walls were paneled in black oak, and the doors and window niches were hung with heavy draperies, giving the entire room a somber and austere appearance. On the shelves stood both modern books and ancient folios in leather bindings. In one corner stood an old clock in a blackened carved case. In the center of the room was a large table surrounded by high-backed carved chairs. The second room resembled a sitting room and was hung with tapestries depicting scenes from the Bible. In one niche stood a Gothic cabinet with small columns, its remarkable carving representing the 12 apostles. Bench-like chairs and wide armchairs were furnished with blue cushions embroidered in silver. On the wall hung a full-length portrait of Narayana in a luxurious costume of the time of Francis I. In the bedroom, on a raised platform beneath a canopy bearing the family crest, stood a huge bed with draperies. The chairs were covered with the same fabric as the drapes. Everything was ancient, slightly faded and time-worn, yet well-preserved and giving a pleasant impression of comfort. And since November had begun, and the ancient walls were cold and damp, fires blazed in all the enormous fireplaces, spreading warmth and lending the gloomy rooms a more cheerful air. In a quarter of an hour, Prince, I will serve your breakfast, and at 7 in the evening dinner will also be ready, the steward said with a bow as he left the room. Supermati had barely completed a quick inspection when the steward returned, carrying a large silver tray, which he set on the library table at his master's indication. What is your name, my old friend? And since when have you served my brother? Supermati asked, carving the cold game. My name is Jean Torcuse, and I served the late prince already in the time of the Crusades. Oh, I have seen the world and lived through many adventures, the steward replied with a sigh. This evening and tomorrow, Torcuse, you shall tell me everything in detail. For now, after breakfast, I would like to inspect the castle, Supermati said, pouring into an ancient, crested goblet a thick, syrup-like wine. What a strange wine you have. Wonderful and unusually dense, he added, taking a sip. This wine is 300 years old. We keep a stock of it in our cellars, which are as well supplied as any monasteries, the steward answered, winking with satisfaction. I never part with the cellar key and make sure the barrels are renewed as soon as they begin to run low. And you do not grow bored here in this solitude, my poor Torcuse. I have not always lived here, your grace. I lived in Tyrol, where the late prince also had a castle, which no longer exists, and later in Brittany. I have lived here only 300 years, and besides, I often went elsewhere. Sometimes I lose count of the years, to avoid attracting attention, and so people wouldn't take me for the devil. In former times I was dangerous and could end at the stake. I take certain precautions and resort to cunning. I dismiss the servants and hire others. Then I grow a beard or shave it, or I dye my hair. Sometimes I leave and return pretending to be a new steward. And since everyone around me dies, and I have as little contact with the village as possible, they forget me, and no one imagines I'm still the same man. I cannot complain. I feel as I did at 20, and I have never been ill. My master was always very kind to me, and often lived here 2 or 3 years at a time whenever he longed for peace and solitude. But, great God, how could he die? He who should never have died? This I cannot understand. Torcuse broke off, grasping his head with both hands. He grew weary of life and yearned for the peace of the grave, Supermati said sadly. Immortality in the flesh has its burdens. Oh yes, you speak the deep truth. I myself am forever tormented by one grief, the grief of outliving everything one loves. How many times I have married, how many children I have had, yet all had to be buried one after another. Even their line has died out. While I remain, that is very hard, for in such a solitary life one becomes especially attached to one's loved ones. The steward wiped away a gathering tear. Supermati bowed his head as well. The grief and melancholy that sometimes tormented him returned once more. But quickly mastering the feeling, he pushed the plate away and rose. Now, my friend, show me the castle. I'm very fond of these old feudal nests. They are always full of ancient lore, and this castle in particular is well preserved. 100 years ago, it was somewhat ruined, but your late brother repaired everything with great care, allowing no alterations. Now it will stand another century or two. With lively interest, Supermati inspected the interior of the castle, where every hall, turret, and vaulted gallery had its own legend, which Torquus briefly related. Yet, however brief these stories were, Supramati gathered from them that both the ancient lords of the castle and Narayana himself had always yielded greatly to the influence of women. On the lower floors, Supramati examined a collection of weapons, not very large, but composed exclusively of rare and precious pieces. Then they descended into the underground chambers, where Torquus showed him solitary cells and dungeons carved into the rock. The doors of two of these terrible prisons were locked, making the sign of the cross. The steward remarked that these two cells had a tragic history. Supramati felt a desire to look into one of these chambers, which must conceal some bloody drama of the past. But noticing the steward's troubled and uneasy expression, he refrained. Torquus, apparently eager to turn the conversation, quickly led him to the wine cellar. The cellar was a vast underground hall. Two massive pillars supported the vaulted ceiling, and along the walls stood enormous barrels the height of a man. They were blackened with age, and each had a brass plate instead of a label, bearing the name and age of the wine it contained. In the corners, buried in sand, lay moss-covered bottles. In the center stood a round table and several benches. From the ceiling, hanging on iron chains, a lit oil lamp cast a trembling red glow on a large silver tray and golden goblets on the table. "Ah, you have already lit the cellar in my honor," Supramati said with a smile. "No, your grace. I never leave this cellar in darkness. Will you not sit, rest a little, and drink a few goblets of the oldest wine we store here? The late prince always did so to celebrate his arrival. He would come down here, I would serve him the best wine, and we would drink to his health, though, thanks be to God, it was always flourishing. But, dear Torquus, if after what I've drunk at breakfast I were to indulge further here, I would be dead drunk," Supramati said with laughter. "It is clear now, Prince, that you have only recently become immortal. Otherwise you would know that you can never truly be drunk." Torquus replied with a sly smile. "In that case, let us drink, but pour yourself a cup as well," Supramati said cheerfully. After drinking a cup of the old aromatic wine, which ran through his veins like fire, he remarked with satisfaction, "Excellent, truly nectar. So, you say, Torquus, that Narayana loved this wine?" "I believe so. When he was at the castle, he often came down here. When he last came here to marry, what? Narayana married 10 years ago." Supramati exclaimed in shock. "But to whom? To Princess Nara?" "No, her name was Eleonora. He brought her here, and an old priest secretly married them in the castle chapel. Then they left, and about a year and a half later they returned. Only the princess was near death, ill, and one fine morning she was found dead in her bed. She is buried here in the family crypt. Countess Gisela also died here. And who was this Countess Gisela? She was the daughter of a Bavarian count. This was during the 30 Years' War. The late prince was then in Wallenstein's army under a false name. Countess Gisela fell madly in love with him, and learning that he was in Wallenstein's camp and that her father and brothers had been killed, she disguised herself as a page and joined him. The late prince was deeply moved by such devotion, and as he had grown weary of the war, he came here with the countess and married her. I can still see her as if alive when she arrived here. She was in deep mourning, but as beautiful as a queen, with her snow-white complexion and eyes sparkling like diamonds. They lived very happily for 5 or 6 years. Then Countess Gisela fell ill and died, giving birth to a boy. The child survived his mother by only a few months. Both are buried in the crypt as well. Were there no other women close to Narayana buried here besides the ones you mentioned? Supramati asked, growing ever more astonished. Certainly there are. A beautiful Saracen, Isolina, and one more. He brought all of them here from Tyrol when lightning struck and burned down the castle. He likely brought the Saracen here after the crusade. Exactly. It was during the Third Crusade when I entered his service. The prince had taken the cross, though under another name, namely Knight Rodek. He gathered and armed a squad of mounted archers, among whom was I, a master of the crossbow. First we served Emperor Barbarossa. Then, I don't know why, my master joined the camp of King Richard of England. I distinguished myself at the siege of St. John d'Acre and thought I saved my master's life twice. You see, I did not yet know he was immortal. Once, in a fierce clash with infidels, when a Saracen horseman nearly crushed his head with an axe, I deflected his blow with the hilt of my sword. Another time, a Saracen woman he had captured and kept in his tent tried to poison him, but I prevented this mischief. He merely laughed, but still expressed his gratitude. When I was gravely wounded at the Battle of Azor, the knight, that is, the prince, took care of me with utmost devotion. Yet I grew weaker and weaker, and one night, I thought my end had come. I felt so ill. The prince came, examined me with concern, and thought long. Then he knelt by my bed and whispered, "Do you wish to recover and live, to live so long that you will lose count of the years? Will you not later curse me for it?" I, of course, did not fully grasp his words, but I wanted to live, so I replied, "Oh, my lord knight, heal me, and I will bless you always, no matter how long my life endures." Then he gave me a wine I had never tasted before. All within me seemed to burn and tear apart. Then I fell into oblivion. When I awoke, I was as healthy and strong as you see me now. Returning to Europe, my master took the beautiful Saracen with him, who soon died. Then he married Isolina, whom he had met at the court of the Austrian Duke. I, as you see, live and live, though at times I feel terribly weary of life. Nevertheless, I cannot complain. The prince always generously rewarded me. I always had the right to reside in any of his domains, and he honored me with his trust. Yet sometimes I was gnawed by a dreadful melancholy, and in one such black moment, I even became a monk. I spent 30 years in a monastery, but eventually that life bored me. I ran away and found my master. He laughed at me and immediately married me off. "To cleanse you of your robe and tonsure," he said. The steward fell silent, lost in his memories. Supramati also grew pensive. Then, quickly straightening, he said, "Torqueus, did you also know Princess Nara, Narayana's widow?" Torqueus shuddered, then answered in a quiet voice, "If you mean the dancer from Benares, then yes. She was blonde with black eyes. I do not know if it is the same one." "Blonde with black eyes," repeated a slightly agitated Supramati. Then, pointing to one of the benches, he added, "Sit, Torqueus, and tell me in detail everything you know about the dancer from Benares. It happened not long ago, no more than 180 years ago," the steward began, gathering his thoughts. "At that time I lived not here, but in Brittany, in another old castle of the prince, and I married my dear Celestine. We were very happy. Our first child had just turned 1, when suddenly the prince arrived unexpectedly. I must add that he had been absent for over 2 years, but where he had been, unknown. He arrived at night in a postal carriage, carrying something wrapped in a cloak resembling a large child. Then he summoned my wife. Afterwards, she told me that the prince had brought with him a very young girl, angelically beautiful, but apparently very ill, for she was unconscious and it took over an hour to revive her. The girl remained dangerously ill for several weeks. The prince was clearly very enamored with her, and together with my wife, devotedly cared for her. Later, I also saw this strange woman. She was indeed devilishly beautiful, yet so kind and gentle that my wife and I grew sincerely attached to her, especially once we began to understand each other. Then we learned she was a dancer from Benares. At first, she spoke only an unknown language, understood only by the prince. As she recovered, she stubbornly refused the clothes my wife brought and continued to lie in bed. Then the prince ordered him to open a chest he had brought, filled with garments we had never seen before, which I took to be Eastern. There were gauze skirts embroidered with gold and silver, colorful scarves, and strange jewels strung on long threads of pearls. The little stranger, who was beginning to walk, was delighted. She immediately dressed, put on wide bracelets on her arms and legs, and decided to dance as soon as she could stand steadily. Later, she often danced, sometimes singing to an accompaniment like a guitar. Oh, how she played and sang, like a true angel. When she danced, she could be mistaken for a heavenly vision. The prince clearly adored her, yet she, strangely, could not bear him and openly showed it. At first, he laughed at this and forcibly kissed her when she pushed him away, but then their relationship soured and quarrels began. They spoke in a language incomprehensible to us, but from tone and gestures, it was clear the words were bitter and hurtful. One night, she fled from the bedroom and took refuge with us. She trembled as if in a fever, half with gestures, half with words in her terrible language. She made clear she did not want him, that he inspired her with terror. A few days later, we were awakened again, this time by the prince's own urgent cries, and everyone rushed into the garden as the shouts came from there. I must say there was a large pond in the garden. It was into this pond that the poor dancer jumped, fleeing from pursuit. The prince must have jumped in himself, as he was drenched, but could not find her. Apparently, he did not know the exact spot where she plunged. The prince ordered torches to be lit and the pond to be searched with poles. To the one who found the drowned girl, he promised a fortune. I had never seen the prince in such fury. He was deathly pale, stamping his feet and uttering terrible blasphemies. After more than an hour of thorough searching, neither nets nor poles yielded anything. Finally, the gardener's assistant, Theophil, found the body and pulled it ashore. The poor dancer appeared dead. Could have been otherwise. After more than an hour underwater, her face was blue, her limbs cold, her light garments clinging to her body, water streaming from her long hair. Like a madman, the prince threw himself at her. His hands trembled, his teeth chattered, yet he allowed no one to touch her and carried her himself to the laboratory. He had a laboratory there? What kind? Supramati interrupted, his head spinning from all he had heard about his predecessor. An alchemist's laboratory, since he would sometimes lock himself there for 2 or 3 days, forbidding anyone to disturb him. We all assumed he was making gold with the devil's help. Everyone feared the place and avoided it. And there he took the dancer and locked himself with her. What he did with her, what magic he used to revive her, no one, not even I, ever knew. Only 3 days later did he emerge with the dancer. She was alive, yet seemed to have no blood in her veins. So transparent was she, and the expression in her eyes simply froze me. Shortly afterward, we returned here. The prince and the Indian woman also arrived, and he said he married her. She no longer resisted and became his wife, but only remained sad and apathetic, as if condemned to death. 3 months later, the prince left, taking his young wife with him, and since then I have heard nothing of her and do not know her fate. I assume she died, for afterwards he married again here. I do not recall the dancer's name well, but it is similar to the name of the princess you mentioned as his widow. Had I seen her, I would probably have told you if it were she, or perhaps she lives if he gave her the same substance as he gave me. This is possible. It is also possible that he married her quietly here. His last wife, entering this castle, left it only to descend into the crypt. Supramati returned to his apartments completely absorbed by all he had heard and dismissed Tortus, postponing further inspection of the castle until the next day. He wished to be alone. The more he thought of Narayana, the more mysterious he became to him. How could he, being initiated into such important and intriguing secrets, fill his life with an unending series of tragic romantic adventures, always ending in the deaths of unfortunate women whom he drew into his embrace from every corner of the universe? The collection of portraits he found in Venice likely served as a memory of those fleeting wives, so swiftly cut down by death. But why did these young lives perish? Was it not the mighty vitality of this man, instead of preserving them, that consumed them? Could it be possible that, in his long life, he had no children, no direct heir? Meanwhile, he bequeathed everything to a stranger. If he gave the elixir of life to a servant, why did he deny it to his child? All these questions remained unanswered. At that moment, he was most concerned with whether Nara and the dancer were the same person. In any case, he would find out when she became his wife. It seemed unlikely to him that this intelligent and sophisticated woman with demonic eyes could be a quiet and ignorant dancer from Benares. Yet, she too might have changed. He asked himself, not without fear, how their intimate life would unfold, whether Nara would be capable of sincere, deep love and content with the quiet, honest family life that Supramati considered the ideal of happiness. He fell asleep very late. The next morning, yesterday's impressions had partly faded, and he set out with fresh interest to inspect his new domains. First, they examined the small walled garden of the castle with its ancient trees, then ascended the highest tower, for which a wonderful view opened up. When Supramati expressed his admiration, Tortus remarked, "Yes, it is fine here, but the prince owned, or rather, you own, a castle in Scotland, which I prefer to this one. It is built on the ocean shore, atop a huge cliff. There, between sky and water, one feels secluded and calm. When the weather is good, the sun's rays scatter like sparks over the wave crests, and seabirds wheel around the balcony. The prince loved this place, especially when dark hours came upon him and he did not know where to escape. But then he loved the storm most of all. When the hurricane roared and the high waves, like mountains of water, crashed onto the rocks with a thunderous sound, he felt well and would not leave the balcony hanging over the abyss. Yes, his soul suffered, and he could find no peace anywhere, Supramati remarked regretfully. The steward sighed. Do you know what he once told me? My misfortune, he says, is that I have no patience to work. If I were to labor, to study, I would lose track of time and be happier. Finally, they inspected the chapel and crypt where the strange Bluebeard had placed the coffins of his numerous wives. The crypt was a large underground hall carved into the rock. In the depths stood a stone altar with a large white marble crucifix, before which a lamp burned. Beyond, in 2 rows, stretched long boxes whose shape and decoration spanned all centuries. If you wish to see the poor deceased, the keys to the coffins are in that box, Tortius noted, pointing to a large blackwood chest with silver corners standing on the altar steps. Supramati hesitated for a moment. Curiosity urged him to look upon his predecessor's victims, yet he felt awkward disturbing the modesty of the poor dead with indecent curiosity. Probably, most of these coffins contain only bones, he replied hesitantly. I don't think so. I myself never dared look at them, but I know that each time the prince visited the castle, he descended here and opened all the coffins. Clearly, he wanted to see his beloved wives, not their crumbling remains. Convinced by this argument, Supramati ordered the chest containing keys of all shapes and sizes to be brought to him. Before opening the coffins, you must light the candelabras in that niche. The late prince always did so. Light them, friend Tortius, Supramati replied, choosing the key to the oldest coffin. Soon 24 candles burned in the ancient candelabras, brightly illuminating the interior of the coffin Supramati had just opened. With a slightly trembling hand, he removed the silk covering, and at that very moment, a cry of astonished admiration escaped his lips. Before him lay a young woman of wondrous beauty, appearing to sleep. She was elegantly dressed and half covered with flowers, as fresh as if just picked. A strange and suffocating fragrance, the same as in the room where Liliana lay, rose in waves from the coffin. The same was true for all the other coffins. In the last coffin rested Eleonora, whom Rihanna had married during his last stay at the castle. She was also enchanting. Supramati wondered why his predecessor, possessing such a powerful means, had not used it on any of his beloved women. How she did not wish to die, poor Eleonora. She loved the prince so dearly that the thought of parting drove her mad. He too wept bitterly and kissed her, ceaselessly repeating, "What mercy of heaven it would be, oh Eleonora, if I could die with you." Tortius recounted, naming in order all the beautiful deceased women. Then, taking one of the fresh flowers, he added, making the sign of the cross over himself, "May God have mercy on my poor master's soul. I never wished to believe that he consorted with the devil, but this flower gives much cause for thought. Without the help of God or a demon, a flower cannot remain fresh for 4 or 5 centuries. Calm yourself, Tortius. The devil had no part in this. The preservation of the flowers, as well as these bodies, is the result of knowledge. Only Narayana could have used this knowledge better." After completing the inspection and having lunch, Supramati expressed to Tortius his surprise that there was no laboratory here, as in Brittany, even though Narayana often and for long periods lived in this castle. "There's a laboratory here. The entrance is from the library, but the door is hidden by paneling," the steward replied. When the highly interested Supramati expressed his wish for Tortius to show him this door immediately, the latter said he did not know the secret of opening it, because the late prince had once forbade him entry forever. He agreed only to roughly indicate its location. They immediately went to the library, and Supramati eagerly began searching for the door. The place indicated by the steward was blocked by bookshelves, and Supramati had to remove them to examine the wall. Nevertheless, it took him more than 2 hours to find the spring, skillfully hidden in the carving of the shelves. Finally, the door opened, and Supramati entered a large windowless hall. In a lamp hanging from the ceiling, a bluish flame burned, like Liliana's coffin, casting a faint light. But this flame almost immediately went out. Supramati brought a lit candelabrum and began to examine the strange room with curiosity. In the depths of the hall stood a massive hearth equipped with bellows and crowded with retorts and other alchemical apparatus. Against the wall was a table shaped like a lectern, to which a thick leather-bound folio was chained with an iron chain. Slightly further stood a cabinet overflowing with leather pouches of various colors, bottles of all shapes, drawers, and parchment scrolls. Along the wall were tripods and strange instruments entirely unfamiliar to Supramati. But what interested him most were two items at the ends of the hall. One was a triangular wooden stand holding a broadsword, blade pointing to the ceiling. The gleaming blade was covered with inscriptions incomprehensible to Supramati. The second was a large metal sheet shaped like a shield, also mounted on a stand, with a hammer resting on a stool nearby. All this was encircled by a red circle drawn on the floor, with Kabbalistic signs on three sides. Never before had Supramati seen the metal from which this shield was made. It seemed at times transparent, at times not, while reflecting all the colors of the rainbow. Wishing to examine this strange object more closely, he stepped over the line of the circle and leaned over the shield. He felt and carefully inspected it, but the examination revealed nothing. The surface was polished. Up close, it appeared uniform, milky in color, but from a distance, it began to shimmer with all the colors of the prism. Suddenly, Supramati had the desire to hear the sound this strange metal made if struck from above. Without hesitation, he lifted the hammer and tapped lightly. A trembling, ringing, prolonged sound, like a groan, resounded. Then a soft noise arose, quickly turning into a whistle, like the wind scattering dry leaves. The whistle shifted to the roar of a waterfall breaking over stones, and finally a dry crack, as if sand lifted by a whirlwind struck glass. All these varied sounds were so strange and changed so rapidly that Supramati could not catch all the nuances. To better orient himself in this chaotic symphony, he struck again. But this blow produced a rumble like distant thunder. Then came a hum of voices, the clash of weapons, neighing, and the pounding of hundreds of horses. All these sounds approached rapidly, seeming so near that Supramati turned, almost falling from horror and astonishment. The red circle in which he stood now glowed with a greenish flame, but beyond it, everything had changed. All the objects in the hall and even the walls disappeared. Around him stretched a mountainous valley, in the depths of which stood a fortress surrounded by high battlements. Everything was illuminated by bluish phosphorescent light, and in this half-light, columns of soldiers approaching the fortress and placing ladders against its walls were clearly visible. On the road moved a large detachment, seemingly hurrying to aid their comrades. A few steps from Supramati, almost touching him, marched warriors at a brisk pace, armed with spears, archers, and armored horsemen. Over all their armor and chainmail were white linen shirts with red crosses on the chest or shoulder. The phosphorescent light played on their weapons and steel helmets, illuminating bearded faces and eyes burning with wild energy and unwavering will. At some distance, a squad of knights moved at a fast trot. At their head rode a tall man with an energetic and haughty face. His flashing eyes expressed cruel severity and yet radiated courage and daring. His helmet, with flowing plumes, was adorned with a small royal crown. Behind him, a knight carried a banner with the arms of England. Behind this proud knight rode an entourage, rich garments, fine weapons, and heraldic crowns on the riders indicated their high rank. The ground shook under the hooves of horses passing so close to Supermati that he could almost touch them. He heard the abrupt and noisy breathing of animals and men and inhaled the distinctive scent of this crowd of knights, pages, and squires, parading before him with banners unfurled, dazzling in their varied and picturesque medieval costumes. A muffled hum of voices and occasional phrases in Old English sounded in his ears. Suddenly, a shiver ran through Supermati's body. There, on a magnificent black steed, rode a knight whose face was familiar to him. Instead of heavy armor, he wore a thin Saracen chainmail, flexible and light as silk. A light helmet without a visor covered his thick, black curls. The knight's large, dark eyes looked at Supermati with an indescribable expression. It was Narayana. As he drew level with the young doctor, his horse made a leap and showered Supermati with sand, causing him to squint and stagger. When he opened his eyes, the vision had already vanished. He was in a laboratory, but he was not alone. On the other side of the fiery circle stood a tall, thin monk with an ascetic face. His dark, deeply sunken eyes glared at Supermati menacingly. Then, raising his bony hand, the monk spoke in a hollow voice. "Foolish ignoramus? You dared to touch with a bold hand secrets you do not understand. If your body were not invulnerable to the forces of nature, this hour would have been your last. Woe to him who summons the invisible world without being armed. Look, and never, until you receive initiation, touch those signs unknown to you, which lead along the dark paths of the occult world." And with horror, he saw a repulsive crowd pressing in behind the monk. Standing, half sitting, and crawling were disgusting creatures, half human, half beast, with bestial faces expressing infernal malice. In his hand, the monk held a bell, which he began to ring. The sound was so piercing that Supermati became dizzy and his vision darkened. He felt as if a whirlwind had lifted him and he was spinning in the air. Then he lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he found himself lying outside the red circle. His head was heavy, his entire body ached, and the room he was in inspired such supernatural dread that he hurriedly left and locked the door. He resolved not to open it again until he was sufficiently equipped to safely confront the terrible occult world he had so unexpectedly glimpsed.